Thank each of you for being here. I want to recognize myself for 5 minutes for opening remarks, and then we'll go into a. Do you want to make an opening statement? No? We'll just go on. Russia has, we've got some people here from Helsinki I'd like to recognize first, some Ukrainian parliamentarians. Where are y'all? Y'all would stand up, please. Appreciate your comment. I'm sorry. Well, maybe we'll meet later, but I wanted you to be here for this hearing. I understand the cultural forces of the military from Ukraine are also here in Washington. Thank you for attending and for your contributions to preserving Ukrainian culture. Thank you. Russia has been an empire for most of its history. The empire of the Tsars created the Soviet Union and made way for it, but it was only a temporary thing. They were not liberators, but they were empire builders. Moscow's interests dominated the Soviet Union, and the republics were valuable for what resources the government could extract from them. It was Russian culture and Russian language that counted. That was it. It was celebrated, respected, and necessary to advance in one's career and society. Entire ethnic groups in the Soviet Union, like the Crimean Tatars in 1944, and North Caucasus people, like the Chechens and others, were deported to Siberia or other regions far from their native lands, many of them not surviving the journey. No one was ever really held to account for the crimes under Stalin and throughout the Soviet history. Stalin's policy of forced collectivization resulted in the Holodomor, famine in Ukraine in 1932 to 1933, and I believe, if I'm correct, this man-made famine also touched southern Russia and Kazakhstan, and they suffered as well. 5 million people totally died of starvation during that time across the USSR. A majority were in Ukraine. This was also a time when Soviet power was going after intellectuals, writers, artists, and others. In fact, Stalin's reputation in Russia these days has received a boost from Putin's patriotic version of history, which he twists to justify his regime's crimes. Though Russia's political ideologies have changed over centuries of empire, the fundamentals are the same: internal repression of minority groups and external aggression toward countries that refuse to bow to the Kremlin. Ukraine has borne the brunt of Russia's imperial rage, but Putin's need for domination persists in its military and psychological operations against Russian neighbors and discrimination toward any and many colonized nationalities and ethnic groups. We'll also hear today how Russia is operating in Africa to spread anti-Western and pro-Russian propaganda while committing atrocities against the local populations. The United States has its own troubled past of colonization, of course, and oppression, but thankfully we live in a country where we can openly acknowledge that, discuss our history, and get better, and we get closer to being a more perfect union, other than that we still have a ways to go. In Russia, there's no attempt to have a more perfect union, only a more perfect Putin. And there's no such thing as a perfect Putin. He's perfectly reprehensible and disgusting. In Russia, so many who have suffered go unheard because truth is silenced, and because the voices of Moscow have usually been the loudest of the entire region. That's why it's so important to listen to the stories of historically marginalized and colonized people. We'll hear from some of these stories today from witnesses. We'll hear from Dr. Botakoz, Kassymbekova, an assistant professor of modern history at the University of Basel, South Switzerland. Next is Philip Obaji, correspondent for the Daily Beast, followed by Dr. Timothy Snyder, who I know from television. He's a TV star, and I always enjoy hearing him. He also goes to Yale, or he teaches at Yale. I don't know if you went there or not. Where'd you go? Brown, okay. Well, that's same league. Different pew, same church, different pew. And finally, Dr. Maria Vyushkova. Yes, thank you. Buryat, Indigenous rights and anti-war activist and researcher. I'm here today because Mr. Wilson, who's the chair, is under the weather a bit, so I'm taking his stead, and we will recognize whoever wants to go first. Dr.
Botakoz, Kassymbekova.
Yeah, I've done it once.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, dear ladies and gentlemen.
Let me say this: you recognize for 5 minutes, and there'll be a red light. A yellow light will say you've got 1 minute to go, and a red light says you're supposed to finish.
Right. Until recently, colonialism seemed to be the thing of the past. We thought that the idea that one nation is entitled to dominate and exterminate other nations, robbing their ability to decide on their future, was gone. Who would have thought that it would be the Russian nation, which proclaimed itself the global leader of communism and anti-colonialism in the 20th century, would lead one of the most brutal colonial conquests in the 21st century? If it was once possible to argue that it was missionary communism against capitalism that led the Russian nation to expansionism, this explanation is no longer sufficient. The truth is that Russian colonialism has a long history which dates 5 centuries back. The Russian nation had 500 years to craft a story of exceptionalism, to grab and rob lands, suppress nations, and create the largest land empire in the world. The difference of Russian colonialism from other European empires, however, is that its metropole never democratized or engaged in self-critical enlightenment. This means that its colonized knew no mercy. Communism itself thrived on Russian colonialism. When the Russian Tsarist Empire collapsed after World War I in 1917, and its numerous colonized nations like Ukraine, Finland, Latvia, Georgia, Estonia, Armenia, Poland, Bessarabia, Belarus, Kazakhs, and Bashkorts, and many others proclaimed independence or autonomy, Communist Moscow brutally reconquered most of them, killing at least 10 million people. In the new communist empire, Bolsheviks proclaimed the Russian nation to be the superior one. Consider this fact. In their national anthems, non-Russian colonized nations had to praise and thank the Russian people for the supposedly bright life under the communist dictatorship. I was one of the children in Soviet Kazakhstan who had to sing an anthem with words, "To the great Russian people we say big thank you." I sang it without knowing that 40% of Kazakhs died in 1930s because of the starvation inflicted on the Kazakh people by Moscow. Moscow stole the cattle of Kazakh nomads, knowingly leaving millions to starvation. My grandmother's family perished in that hunger, and she was forcibly taken to a Russian orphanage where 60% of Kazakh children died. There she was taught to forget her language, her parents, and to praise the Russian nation for communism. As you know, in the Ukrainian case, 4 million people died, and today Ukrainian children are taken to Russia. Russian colonialism was historically based on the strategy of killing, deporting, and terrorizing the local population, Russifying them, and settling the territories with the Russian people. Consider this quote from a Russian colonial officer about the strategies of conquest in the Northern Caucasus in the 1860s. I quote, "The expulsion of half of the mountain people and the settlement with Russians, these were the war plan. The Russian population was not only to be the crowning glory of the conquest of the region, it was to become one of the main means of conquest." This strategy continued into the communist period. The Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and many others were killed and deported from their lands in the 1940s. Terrorized and forbidden to learn their languages, they were taught to praise the Russian nation instead. The Russian people, when settling, accepting privileges, and listening to Soviet anthems, learned to think that the colonized land is theirs. As a result, in 1989, the last communist ruler, Mikhail Gorbachev, argued against lending independence to non-Russian nations, which demanded independence, because he said, and I quote, "The Russian people are that way." Although in 1991 communism collapsed, the Russian imperial identity did not. For many of us who experienced Russian colonialism firsthand, there are 4 lessons from the 20th century. First, the collapse of the Soviet Russian Empire was the victory for the humanity. Millions of people received the possibility to live in dignity, freedom, and the ability to decide their own futures. This would not have been possible under the Russian occupation. Secondly, although communism failed, Russian colonialism did not. It was never questioned by the Russian intellectuals, liberal or illiberal, its leaders, and by the world at large. But we now know that it was not just communism that was incompatible with democracy, equality, and peace. In fact, it is Russian colonialism that is not. Thirdly, in 1991, Moscow argued that without its control, the colonized nations will present danger to the world. This was a colonial lie, and today we know that it is a colonial lie. Out of all former Soviet republics, it is the Russian one that presents the most danger to the world. Finally, Russian colonialism, just as communism, is not reformable because it is a system based on ideology. Just like communism, it has no future. Unlike communism, it can collapse only if actively defeated. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Professor Snyder, please, 5 minutes.
Okay.
We're talking about a particular historical structure. For the last 500 years of world history, empire has been the dominant structure. The last 100 years or so have seen a contestation of that, of which the Russo-Ukrainian War is probably the latest continuation. A dominant center and the exploited periphery. This very often corresponds to a dominant nation or a dominant group and exploited national minorities. Empires do is to negate. They carry out policies, statements, ideologies of negation. They deny, and this is true of history as well as of the present war, they deny the reality of other states. Other states are not real. An empire is real. Other states are not. Other nations are not real. The dominant power, the dominant center of an empire is real, but not other nations. According to this very brief summary, the Russian Federation of 2024 is very clearly an empire, and its ideology is very clearly imperial. Russian elites say so themselves, including in official foreign policy documents. Their idea is that empire has not been consigned to the past, but that empire should continue, that the imperial moment goes on. The structure of the Russian Federation, as well as the structure of how they fought this war, is also imperial. A center in Moscow and Petersburg exploits a periphery, an Asian periphery, for its resources. The minorities, first of all, including Buryats, and by poor people. The occupation has treated Ukrainians as an inferior people with no right to exist. Therefore, the structure. The theory of time is very present in this war. In this war, Mr. Putin says that Russia has the right to destroy Ukraine because something happened 1,000 years ago. I'll spare you the details, but it doesn't get better if I give you the details. It just gets worse and stupider. The idea is that Russia is innocent because of something that might have happened to a Viking 1,000 years ago and therefore can invade Ukraine. I've now given it more dignity than it deserves. That's the theory of time, right? And because of that, Russia has history laws which make it illegal to question the official the official version of history. And because of this theory of time, anything which looks like Ukrainian culture, such as the representation we just had, is claimed not to have existed. And thus we have imperial negation in practice. Inside occupied Ukraine, the murder of local elites, the deportation of children for their Russification, on the logic that there's no Ukraine anyway, the deliberate destruction of publishing houses, archives, and libraries. And I would note that historically, the Bandura Plain, which you just saw, was treated as part of Ukrainian culture that didn't exist in the Soviet Union, and Bandura players were executed, which leads me to a very specific form of negation. Russia in this war is repeating very specific imperial practices of the Soviet Union and indeed of Nazi Germany, while denying that those things ever happened, which is part of this larger notion of time. All right, so what does that mean for policy? I'll make 5 very quick recommendations. Number 1, Myths of empire can only grow when nobody knows anything about history, which unfortunately, as a first approximation, describes us. Number two, if we're going to be anti-imperial, we also have to be reflective. As Representative Cohen suggested, if Americans are going to talk about anti-imperialism, they better be ready to talk about their own imperial past, or else no one in the Global South will take us seriously. And people from the Global South have to be brought into this conversation, or it makes no sense. The third thing we need to say is that imperialism directly contradicts the basic foundations of the international legal order. It's not just some funny idea, it's counter to everything we take for granted and that brings us stability. Fourth, Americans who are against empire should be in favor of the European Union. The European Union is the way that European states have found another kind of political organization, a way to interact that is post-imperial and anti-imperial. And fifth, and perhaps most important, it's important to note that empires usually lose their wars. Empires usually lose their wars. Since 1945, the bigger country, the empire, has usually lost its wars. That means that we can expect, or it wouldn't be strange if Russia would lose its war. And then underneath that, it should lose its war, even if all you care about is Russia, because the only way that empires in Europe have transitioned into becoming rule of law states is by losing their last imperial war. So an analysis of the history of empire would lead you to the conclusion that doing what one can to help Russia lose this imperial war would be good not only for the people that Russia is oppressing and whose existence they're denying, but also good for Russia itself. Thank you.
Mr. Obaji, please, 5 minutes.
Much, members of the Commission. It's a huge privilege to be with you today. And it's also a great honor for me to appear with Dr. Kassymbekova, Professor Snyder, and Dr. Vyushkova. Last year, I wrote one of the most powerful stories published anywhere, an in-depth investigation on the operations of Russian paramilitaries in the Central African Republic following the death of Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin, who, by the way, never said anything good about me. The account revealed how so-called Russian military instructors operating under the command of the Russian Ministry of Defense slaughtered dozens of people to secure access to a gold mine in the north of the CAR, that's short for Central African Republic. Traveling from my home in Nigeria to Central Africa last December wasn't my first. I had spent years highlighting the plight of people maltreated and abused by Russian paramilitaries. And that has not gone unnoticed by the Russians. In 2022, I became a target of the Wagner Group after exposing the wrongdoing of their mercenaries operating across Africa. Contacts told me that my photo had been circulating on chat groups used by locals recruited by Wagner, who have apparently denounced me as an obstacle to fighting extremism in the CAR and claimed that I am an agent of the West who should be arrested or killed. I traveled to regions of the CAR where militias had previously attacked outsiders with slingshots, machetes, and guns. I was held for hours by rebels who initially accused me of attempting to spy on them. Days later, on the border with Cameroon, I was arrested, tortured, and detained overnight by Central African forces, acting on the orders of Russian paramilitaries after soldiers saw me interviewing artisanal miners who were attempting to flee the country following attacks on their community by Russian paramilitaries. Soldiers beat me, confiscated my phone and camera. No amount of intimidation was going to stop me from continuing my investigation. After the soldiers released me, I crossed into Cameroon, bought new equipment, and returned to the CAR to finish the work I had started. Now, the attack by Russian paramilitaries on locals in the northwestern Central African town of Koki, in which at least 50 villagers were killed, became an obsession for me, all the more because the victims were ordinary people who had done nothing wrong. I managed to interview 16 witnesses to the attack. They all told me the same thing. Russian paramilitaries slaughtered their friends, colleagues, family members, and neighbors simply because the Russians wanted to secure access to Koki's gold mine. That wasn't all. In the middle of December 2023, I traveled to Bois in the northwest of the CAR, where I interviewed a dozen girls who told me Russian paramilitaries lured them into a military base on the outskirts of town and then drugged and raped them before administering contraceptive shots and pills to them. A couple of other girls described to me how Russian paramilitaries held them at gunpoint on their farmlands and then took turns raping them right in front of their family members. In Mali, where I recently interviewed women raped and abused by Russian paramilitaries, the Wagner Group continues to operate in the country on behalf of Vladimir Putin's regime, helping government forces in central and northern Mali carry out raids and drone strikes that have killed scores of civilians, including many children. Like in the CAR, Russian activities in Mali have exacerbated long-running lawlessness, corruption, violence, and human rights abuses with total impunity. Russia continues to be a primary purveyor of disinformation in Africa, sponsoring over 80 documented campaigns targeting more than 22 countries. The United States is also being targeted. I recently found dozens of sponsored articles by pro-Russian media outlets in West and Central Africa, making claims like the largest park in the CAR has been mismanaged by Americans who have deployed rebels from Joseph Kony's Lord Resistance Army in the DRC to the Central African Republic. Now, finally, Russia has promulgated disinformation to undermine democracy in at least 19 African countries, contributing to the continent's backsliding on this front. From Africa, Russia is also targeting American democracy. I look forward to your questions, and thank you for the privilege of testimony today.
Thank you, Mr. Obaji. Dr. Vyushkova, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be testifying here at this hearing on behalf of Russia's indigenous activists. My research focuses on the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the indigenous people of Russia's North, Far East, and Siberia. From the very first days of the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, it has been reported that Russia's ethnic minorities are overrepresented, both in the invasion forces and among the Russian side casualties. If we look at the top 10 Russia's regions by per capita death toll, we'll see that 7 out of 10 are ethnic republics or okrugs, with the Asian republics of Tuva, Buryatia, and Altai at the very top of the list. The indigenous ethnic groups living in those regions are very significantly overrepresented among the Russian side war casualties, with Telengits living in Altai showing 11.5 times greater per capita death toll compared to Russia's average. The small-numbered indigenous peoples of the North, Siberia, and Far East, such as Telengits, Udegen, Ganasan, and Chukchi, are hit the hardest. The per capita death toll for those ethnic groups being much higher than even for Buryats or Tuvans. For instance, Nenets living in Nenets Autonomous Okrug, one of the most economically prosperous regions of Russia, don't benefit at all from the booming extractive industry there. Instead, it destroys the environment, threatening their traditional way of living. Nenets are very significantly overrepresented among the region's war casualties, as well as among those who were specifically recruited from prisons. In September 2002, Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization in Russia. The indigenous rights activist organizations such as Free Buryatia Foundation, Free Yakutia Foundation, Botany Indigenous Foundation received multiple reports of disproportional draft of indigenous men. Official documents show that Buryatia, my home region, was hit disproportionately hard by the mobilization. In Khabarovsk Krai and Republic of Sakha-Yakutia, the small-numbered indigenous peoples of the north were drafted more often than the rest of each region's population. In Khabarovsk Krai, the indigenous men were drafted almost 3 times more often than non-indigenous population. According to the Botany Foundation, in one Nanai settlement, the authorities attempted to draft 100% of adult male population. In the Udege settlement of Gwasyugi, they drafted 30% of adult men. Thus, whole indigenous cultures are at risk of disappearing within the next several decades. Russian legislation, ostensibly meant to exempt small-numbered indigenous peoples from the mandatory military service, totally fails to protect them. The fact that indigenous people of Russia's North, Far East, and Siberia are overrepresented in the Russian invasion army has led to the formation of the warlike, bloodthirsty, savage stereotype against the indigenous people, most notably against the Buryats, Tuvans, and the Nenets. Apparently, not just the death toll, but also the moral burden of Russia's aggression against Ukraine was put disproportionately on the indigenous people. Unfortunately, such prominent public figures as Pope Francis, the head of the Catholic Church, started spreading this narrative, making the indigenous people a potential target for hate crimes, especially given that some of us live in Ukraine or in other countries abroad. There were a number of the war crime allegations against the indigenous troops, which turned out to be false, most notably about the Bucha massacre, which was falsely blamed on the ethnic Buryat troops. However, it has been established beyond any reasonable doubt that it was the paratroopers from the Russian city of Pskov, almost exclusively ethnic Russians, who were responsible for the Bucha massacre. However, the Buryats in Bucha myth still persists among the anti-war Russian public, as well as in Ukraine and in the West. I think that for the Russian anti-war influencers, the motivation is obviously the desire to shift the responsibility away from the Russians. According to the recent study by Dr. Adam Lenton of the Wake Forest University, the Russian public opposed to Putin's regime and sympathetic to liberal views tends to be significantly more xenophobic towards Russia's ethnic minorities than the society in general. This is a very alarming result, posing a question whether the possible regime change would bring a better future for Russia's indigenous peoples. In conclusion, let's not forget that there are more than 240 indigenous political prisoners in Russia. Please spread the message that in any future prisoner exchanges with Russia, they should not be overlooked. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor, and thanks to all of the witnesses for that very powerful testimony. There is a speaking order. I know the chairman normally asks questions. However, I'm filling in for the chairman, so I don't think it's appropriate that I go. Instead, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Whitehouse for his 5 minutes of questioning based on a timing issue that he has in having to leave. So, Senator, please, 5 minutes.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. My questions will be for Professor Snyder. Thank you for being here, Professor. Good to see you. I'd like to hear your comments on something just vibrated over here. That wasn't me. How the international dark money network supports corrupt oligarchies that produced Putin. He's now sort of the oligarch in chief. He either has them all in tow or he's had them killed or sent off or intimidated. And it looks to me like a colleague of yours, a historian, wrote about a clash of civilizations, that our clash of civilizations is between this kleptocratic oligarchy and representative democracy. Is that a context that is worth looking at, what led to Putin's rise to power? That's the question. More a topic than a question.
No, that's excellent. There is, of course, an obvious connection between extractive empires and oligarchs or very wealthy people. Control of hydrocarbon resources, as in the Russian Far East, is quite a simple way for a few people, an individual or a clan, to become very wealthy. It's a simple extractive process. It can be the territory can be controlled by force, and then, as in Russia and other hydrocarbon states, you see that one clan or one group, one family, as the Russians say, end up controlling all of the wealth. So there is, in this case, a very direct connection between the processes described here and the power of Putin or whoever might succeed Putin, so long as Russia is an extractive hydrocarbon regime. And of course, you're right that this is an international phenomenon, and whencesoever the wealth might arise, if one is American or British or responsible for policy in a number of other states, one should be very concerned about the fact that there are not just loopholes, but giant inviting windows through which international oligarchs can hold and launder their money. This is a subject beyond the borders of my own expertise, but I think it's very important to note that international dark money networks exist because of us and not just because of the people that we're calling the bad guys. And you're right, of course, as well, that Putin's succession and rise to power involved a kind of parade of oligarchs with whom at first he was in some kind of agreement, and then he showed by example, most prominently in the case of Botakoz, who controlled precisely hydrocarbon resources, that anyone who wasn't with him was against him and would be treated as a criminal. And then there's a final connection, which is maybe the most interesting. Putin, as one of the richest men in the world, joins the other rich men in the world in having lots of very strange ideas about the future. And the very strange ideas that our oligarchs have, Russian or otherwise, tend to bend us into conflicts which we might otherwise avoid. It's not healthy to think we're all going to go to Mars. It's not healthy to think we're all going to live forever. It's not healthy to think there's no Ukraine, which is Putin's particular oligarchical fantasy.
It's not healthy to think that Russia is an imperium awaiting to manifest itself. Well, thank you very much. One of the folks I traveled with a lot and learned a good deal from was my colleague in the Senate and quite a dear friend, John McCain. And I guess I'll summarize with his famous quote about Russia, which is that it is a gas station that is run by a mafia that happens to have an army. And I think you summarized that very well, Professor Snyder. So thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I think Mr. Quigley has to go somewhere, and since I've been somewhere, I'm going to let you go somewhere.
We're all going somewhere. Doctor, help me. Maybe I missed it, but your facts, while compelling, lead to conclusions that I was waiting for you to state, right? At least one of them has to be that this war has many advantages for Putin. One is he can, as you described, use it as an assault on indigenous people, but also fight a war of attrition, seemingly much longer than Ukraine might be able to, because he can treat people he doesn't care for like cannon fodder. But would you extrapolate on those and anything else that I might be missing about how Putin's choice and how he's conducting this war reflects your facts?
All right. I strongly believe that Putin's regime Putin is trying to reduce the political risks for himself by conducting this war at the expense of the vulnerable, discriminated groups no one cares about, including...
If there were other groups he was drawing into.
Exactly. For instance, such groups include migrants, prisoners, convicts recruited from prison, homeless people even, and unfortunately ethnic minorities are one of those discriminated and disadvantaged groups. So it's just politically safer to conduct this war at the expense of, disproportionately at the expense of ethnic minorities. But I don't think that it is a deliberate ethnic cleansing policy, so to say. So it's just the result of the indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities being discriminated group. So it's just politically safer for the local authorities, for instance, to draft the indigenous men 3 times more often in Khabarovsk, for instance. And actually 80% of the indigenous men from Khabarovsk who ended up fighting in this war, 80% of them were drafted against their will, actually. And only 20% went there voluntarily. But unfortunately, the ethnic minorities, and especially the small numbered indigenous nation of the North and Far East, they are so discriminated against, and their social status is so significantly lower than their Russian counterparts that it's totally politically safe to do whatever they want, like draft 100% of adult men from a non-ICE settlement.
If anyone else would like to comment on that.
If I could just come in briefly on the premise, of course it's right that Putin's ability to treat much of his population or the population of occupied Ukraine as he wishes is an advantage in some sense. It doesn't, though, mean that his troops are motivated the way that troops on the other side are. It's also a disadvantage to be coercive. Zelensky and the other side have the advantage that many of the people in the army are there because they have some notion of why they're there and they're defending their homeland. And then just as a factual matter, I would point out that, and perhaps you'd want to comment on this, but as a factual matter, you do eventually start having to draft people from the big cities and start having to draft the Russians, which means that the longer the war goes on, the harder it might become to just continue to carry out what you're calling a war of attrition, because the longer it goes on, the more Russians, the more middle-class people, the more city people you do have to bring into the army, and they're getting to that point now.
Yes, I would like to add that there is a huge national awakening among the non-Russian nations within the Russian Federation. There are nations, 21 nations. They have their own parliament. They have their own constitutions. They are not ethnic minorities. And there is a huge awakening also because many of them have left Russia. They went to places like Kazakhstan, where they say, oh, we didn't know that one can actually live in one's own republic with dignity and the ability to exercise one's culture, learn one's language. And so the political geography is changing now. There are very strong voices for the independence of these nations, and we need to look at them. And they're not only ethnic minorities, there are real nations within the Russian current empire.
You yield. Mr. Quigley yields. Ms. Bartz, if you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we know, ethnic cleansing, oppression, and racist policy of superiority has been Russia for centuries, But my question for Dr. Vyushkova, do you think the ethnic people realize that, that they've been oppressed? I mean, do you see on the ground they have understanding they've been screwed and resources and money with oligarchs taken from them? They live pretty miserably poor. Is that understanding on the ground?
Revival of ethnic activism and indigenous rights activism in Russia is a very important sign, I believe. There are a lot of decolonial activists and indigenous rights activists and ethnic anti-war activists from Russia, but most of them obviously were forced to leave Russia. But this war, of course, changed our understanding of our identity. Probably not the majority of our nations, but many people, they just realized that this type of imperial aggression against Ukraine, it has very similar roots as how we are treated inside Russia. And especially the fact that ethnic minorities were so much overrepresented among the war casualties, like they had to, the war death toll was put disproportionately hard on their shoulders. This also made people realize that yes, they are actually exploited subject, as Professor Snyder put it. So I think there are very significant changes, but probably they are not as fast as we would want them to be.
Right. Well, that ethnic cleansing been happening right now in Russia. It's very racist and policies that they do in it. And they think that they're superior. They teach their kids they're superior to everyone, including to Ukrainians. That's been taught, unfortunately, for generations. It's sadly, even though a lot of them live pretty bad life. My questions to Mr. Obaji. I can say other names better than yours, but I'll do my best. I think what's happening in Africa is disgraceful. It's awful. What China and Russia are doing right now, it's just really, destroying the continent, taking advantage of resources and really enslaving people. It's sad to see, and for me, that the international community is not standing up more to see that. And unfortunately, a lot of American companies are afraid even now to go to Russia. So, China take resources, Russia, is a force there that, with their military force now, what they're doing, it's awful. But have you seen any positive moves happening? And I think what Africa Corps are doing right now, it's brutal, it's awful, and they've been doing it for a while. But have you seen any positive things that people actually start realizing, or some governments, or it's so corrupt and so bad and people afraid that it's just really in terrible shape? It's awful. Can you share with us any positive things that happening in Africa right now that some of these governments are waking up?
Well, positive. If you say in terms of, if your question is positive in terms of, Russia being present in Africa, and whether or not some governments are seeing their presence as being positive, the answer is yes, if that's what you mean. Some countries, not all countries. So let me be clear. The Russians are mostly active in the Central African Republic, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in Niger. But they have troops on the ground in the Central African Republic, in Mali, and recently we saw about 300 members of the BA Brigade make it to Burkina Faso. The reason why they are able to have a field day in these countries is that, to start with, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are under military dictatorship, and much of the rest of the world really have cut ties with these countries. They're under sanctions by the African Union, sanctions by ECOWAS, that's the West African regional body, and also with the EU. And that has created an opening for the Russians to get there. In the Central African Republic, for some reason, I don't even know why the West have completely looked away from that country.
Right.
And because that happened, the Russians saw an opening to get involved. But yes, corruption in these countries, in these administrations, have made it a lot easier for the Russians to act with impunity, for the Russians to carry out massacres, in numbers that no one has ever seen before.
Right.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll have better policies. And as we're talking, Professor Snyder, I know that my time is out, but unfortunately, Soviet Union lost the war, but not won the peace, because we didn't have Jeffersons and Washington there to write democratic, constitution and write the republics. And unfortunately, most of these republics fell back into dictatorship and corruption, including, I didn't get a chance, but maybe some other time I do it to actually see what's happening in Central Asia. But it's very important because people been oppressed there for a while too. But I think my time is, I'm run out of time, so I have to yield back, but thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chair Cohen, and I appreciate this opportunity to be a part of this hearing at the Helsinki Commission with the Helsinki Commission. So thank you very much, and thanks to all. Past couple months, I've been to Ukraine twice, including this last weekend. So if I can't form complete sentences because I'm exhausted, that's the reason. But I've also been to the Sahel as well, numerous times. Every August, myself and Austin Scott would go on a bipartisan trip to the Sahel every year. And obviously, what we've seen in that area and what I saw is that those are countries and areas that are clearly being affected by much of what you talked about, the desire of Putin to create and maintain an empire. Now, when I was in Kiev in early August, I came in through Moldova. We drove into, it was unlike the regular congressional trips in that we actually got to stay on the ground for 5 nights. Moldova to Odessa night, and then up to Kiev, and then around the surrounding areas. Had a fruitful meeting with the President Zelensky, other military leaders, and basically allowed to speak to civilians. And one of my takeaways from that trip was the appreciation of the United States' support for Ukraine, but in particular, the F-16s, not just from military leaders, but the morale boost that it provided civilians on the ground how much basically they appreciated that, even though they may not know the extent of what it can do. The fact that we were supporting them with that particular piece of equipment was very important to the civilians. And then last weekend, I attended the Yalta European Strategy Conference. But beyond that, we actually took a train out to Kharkiv and saw the destruction that the Russians imposed upon the people of Kharkiv, and actually stood on a burnt-out, gutted, Soviet-style apartment building, about 12 floors, took the stairs to the top, and actually looked in to Russia. And you could see basically where the Russians were coming from. In two of those trips, obviously, the desires that we heard from most people were that they need air defenses and they need permissions. Now, when I went to Africa in Sahel, obviously you saw the influence in Wagner. And in fact, we went to Niger and we were able to get in and meet with the leadership of Niger. And what you're seeing is obviously not just in Niger, but as you said, Mr. Obaji, in Mali and BF, in CAR, in Libya, is the influence of Russia's. And the fact that the Russians, obviously starting with Wagner and Prigozhin, and then turning into Africa Corps now, and literally becoming an offshoot of Russia. But they're taking advantage of these coups. They're taking advantage of the corruption. They're taking advantage of the dysfunction, unfortunately, of these governments at this point. And that is where I believe that the United States must still continue to engage with these countries. And as you said, not just pull our stakes, but actually try to engage, because I do believe that it's our standards and our ways, I think, that are everlasting, not the standards of Russia. But Mr. Snyder, Professor Snyder, if I could, as you know, next week we're going to see President Zelensky come to the United States and present a victory plan. Obviously, what we're seeing right now is a war of attrition, where it's basically kind of a war of butchery, to be honest with you, and that Putin is just throwing humans at the problem, throwing these Russians that they're going in and taking advantage of by paying them an exorbitant amount of money, at least for them, to be on these front lines. When you look at this so-called plan, Professor, if you were to advise Zelensky in dealing with Putin, what would your victory plan entail?
I'm an American talking to Americans, and I'm gonna keep it in those terms. First, if I could just note, there's a very important connection between Russian empire and the way the United States has thought about the Russo-Ukrainian war. From the very beginning, we have tended to treat Russia as a real country because we're aware of its big history, big literature, big past. Many of us learned about it in school. And many of us imbibed the Russian imperial narrative, according to which the peoples that we've been speaking about today were secondary, irrelevant, troublemakers, nationalists, to somehow be dismissed. And I think that was deep under our skin and had a lot to do with the misjudgments that Americans made in general in February 2022, when we took for granted as a society and as a polity that Ukraine would break within a few days when Russia invaded. And I think we are still in a process of de-imperializing or decolonizing our own minds vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think we have seriously underestimated the potential of the Ukrainian armed forces and the potential of Ukrainian society, partly because we have taken in imperial assumptions ourselves. And it seems to me that that should be a part of what we're talking about today. So part of being an empire is controlling the discourse. And to a large degree, the Russians have been able to control the strategic discourse, setting up for us new rules in war, which have never existed before. Like, for example, that when you invade another country, the entire war should take place on the territory of the country you've invaded. No one has ever said that before because it's completely absurd. And yet somehow it's been accepted in the United States as normal that this war should be fought on Ukrainian territory. There is no precedence for that kind of idea. Another idea that the Russians have that we've accepted is that it's normal, for example, when you and I were in Kiev, for ballistic missiles to rain down on the city where we were trying to do normal business, but it's somehow not normal for ballistic missiles from Ukraine to go into Russia. Why is that? Why is it normal for one country and not for another? It has a great deal to do with imperial thinking, which we have accepted. There's something precious, special, et cetera, about Russia, and somehow it's okay for Ukrainians to be victims because they always have been victims. We need to investigate, I think, That understructure of thinking, which I believe has guided our policy in the wrong way. So as far as empires are concerned, I'll return to what I said at the end, trying to respond now to your question about a victory plan. I believe the Ukrainians are right about something that they're hard pressed to convince us of, and I think what I'm saying now is consistent with the history of empire. The Russians are going to negotiate peace when they believe they are losing. And so if anyone is serious about negotiation, that person should be trying to get the Russians into a position where they think they might be losing. The Ukrainians get that, but they're having a really hard time making us understand that pairing. So when they talk about a victory plan or a peace plan, what they mean is together the West and Ukraine do enough to get Russia to a point where it might negotiate sincerely. They're not there now.
Outstanding, thank you. Exactly. And if I may just briefly, with your indulgence, Mr. Chair, Dr. Kassymbekova, I've been to Kazakhstan. I believe that Kazakhstan should be granted permanent normal trade relations, and we should get rid of Jackson Vanik for Kazakhstan. I will say that, and I will yield back.
Thank you. I'm going to do something that I don't think is not normal. I don't think it's ever been done. I'm going to ask our guests from Ukraine, our 4 members of parliament from Ukraine, and our cultural folk from the military who I know are here to perform and not to. But do you have any questions you'd like to ask of any of the panelists or statements you'd like to make concerning any of these issues? Stand up if you'd like to speak and identify yourself. Yeah. Sure, you can. Yes, sir. Would you stand up? Tell me your name. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your support and for everything that the United States does to Ukraine. Because, of course, we need to win, and it's the only chance for us to live and be alive is to win in this war. Because evil would never stop. Putin will never stop, and any thinkings about frozen in a conflict or something like this, the war will start in 2 years, 3 years. 5 years. And, I'm representative of Poltava region, and 2 weeks ago, it was a horrible thing. Russia bombed university in Poltava, and more than 60 people died. They were students. They were 17, 18, 19, so kids.
Was that the military school?
Yes, but they were students.
I got you.
But they were students, and they were not yet soldiers.
I got you.
And about 200 people were injured, and 20 people we could not even find where they are. So, but we understand that when rocket bombs, there's nothing left, especially nothing left from people. And the thing that we really, really need is the permission for us to hit these military objects on Russia territory. Because Poltava region, we are 100 kilometers to the board with Russia, and 120 kilometers to the active war in Kharkiv. And they put those systems that send ballistic rockets near the board, and it's only 100 kilometers. It's 1 minute till the ballistic bomb falls in Poltava region. In Sumy region, it's 20-30 seconds. So there's no possibility for the people to run in the shelter. It was the same situation in Poltava's university. People just didn't have an ability to run in the shelter because it's not enough time. It was only 1.5 minutes starting from the alarm till the university was already attacked by the rockets. So we really need this permission, and we want to win. We're doing everything to win, and our best people are doing everything for to fight and to stand, stand with us, help us, and of course,
join us in going to I will vote.
We want to do everything to win. Thank you very much, and thank you for that your country does to us. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I was trying to find a report that I saw yesterday, and I hope you all have seen, about the drone attacks on the Russian missile security area. They apparently knocked out 300 or 400 ballistic missiles, and they said it was like an earthquake and 2.6 on the Richter scale. Take that, Vladimir. I wish I could tell you that we're allowing the weapons to be used to go outside of Ukraine and to penetrate Russia. I've signed a letter with about 20 or 30 other members, most of Helsinki members in foreign relations, but we've signed that, and I support it, and I hope that it's allowed. I certainly understand it. Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah.
Sure.
During all history, Russia tried to destroy Ukrainian culture.
Tell me who you are.
My name is Miguel Sarga. I'm the founder of Cultural Forces. Cultural Forces is military unit in Ukraine, which supporting moral psychological state of the soldiers on the front line. Before the war, we artists.
Thank you. Professor Snyder had to go, so it's not because of you.
Yeah, and on the first day of the war, we become soldiers, and then after some period of time, we came back to our main weapons, to our poems, to our songs, to our instruments. And right now in Cultural Forces, we have 80 artists, and every day we're working on the front line. We have 8 groups, each group making 3-4 concerts per day. So every day we're doing about 25 concerts on the front line. So during the war, we made more than 4,500 concerts in front of the troops in the combat zones. And right now we're here in the United States to say thanks to American people for your support, to share our culture, our emotion, our reflex, our experience through our culture. Russia tried to destroy Ukrainian culture during all the history. In the beginning of 20th century, they collected invited all the bandura players, kobza players, to like festival and killed everybody and burned their instrument. In the beginning of this event, we made a little performance before you came, and it was bandura player Taras Stoya. So all the bandura players in Ukraine at that time was killed, because bandura was an instrument of freedom, an instrument of soul, and it shows what is Ukrainian soul to Ukrainian people, and they wanna break the chains, yeah, when they have this music. So Russian killed them. Russian killed a lot of young Ukrainian poets and writers. How they did that? They invited everybody of them and said, we will give you free flats, free rooms in big building, which called the building of S, like as the first word in Ukrainian word, like будинок слова. And they killed half of all the citizens in this building. Another half they put in the jails. So they killed. It called.
Was this the beginning of the 20th century too? Same time?
Yeah. So all the time they trying to destroy Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian artists. Right now we are Ukrainian artists. We're here. Yuri Vaskevich, opera singer who lost his leg on the front line. Sasha Bul, very famous Ukrainian country singer. Two more, like Olga Rukavishnikova, violinist, she lost her eye on the front line. And we come here to United States, and we will have tour here on the south part of United States. So my question, what we can do to help you to convince American people to support Ukraine more, to don't let Russia make the new circle of killing Ukrainian artists, Ukrainian brains, Ukrainian hearts.
Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your service and supporting your country in the war. I'm sorry about the injuries that happens, but committing yourself to continue to support the troops on the front lines, and that's admirable. I didn't really know about all that, so I appreciate it. I've had a resolution which I've tried to pass, and having declared that Russia's committing genocide now. And what they've done, they've destroyed a lot of artifacts, cultural artifacts in Ukraine, and I think they've, that's part of genocide. What you can do to help, I think your touring around is important for the Americans to see and to hear your stories. And I don't know where you're going in the South, but that's a good place to go because there are a lot of people there that are more likely to be affected by the information put out by Trump and that world that say that we should be spending our money at home on domestic, but that's an excuse. What they really want to do is they want to be buddies with Putin. Trump and Putin have got a relationship, and it's unfortunate. So we've got an election coming up, but I think if they see you, I think it's important and good, and to understand that if Ukraine goes, the Baltics, Poland, Europe's next, and then Putin's not going to stop, and they need to know that and see that, and eventually if it goes to NATO, it's going to mean American troops on the ground, and those folks aren't going to want to see that either because it's going to be some of their sons and daughters. So, Myra, where are you going in the South? Where's your tour?
I have a tour list.
Do you go to Memphis?
Let's say, could you help us? You know, you was on schedule.
Are they scheduled to go to Memphis?
Yes, I think they're planning to go
Good. Do you know when?
to Texas, they go to Alabama, to South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida.
When do they go to Memphis?
Taxes. Memphis.
We will
1 second.
find out that for you.
That's my home.
We'll find out.
And it's a great music city. Yeah. Hopefully I'll be
If we don't have
there.
it in schedule, we will put it.
Okay.
After this conversation.
But I appreciate what you're doing, and it's admirable. And it's hard for me to fathom. I mean, it's all about his ego, and I don't know how you change that. Maybe you kidnap his ballerina girlfriend. Otherwise, he's not going to stop. He may let her go. Would you like to ask a question, sir, or make a statement?
You can sing the question.
Old Man River, he just keeps rolling, he just keeps rolling.
Can you do that?
For beautiful, for special skies, for every...
Amber Grains.
Sorry.
You're doing good.
Green, for purple mountain majesties, above the frighted plain. America, America, God sheds His grace on thee. I'm crowned good with brotherhood, from sea to shining sea. All right.
Bravo, bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't think anybody can top that, so I want to I want to thank our panelists for being here, our witnesses, and for your testimony, and everybody, and the members of Parliament. I think you got some time to come to my office, and we can talk some more, and if y'all would like to come, you're more than welcome to. And with that, this meeting of the Helsinki Commission is concluded.